Thanks, Emily, for the introduction. So happy to be here with everybody here today to talk about something that I'm super passionate about. For those who don't know me, my name's Stephen Dowling. I'm a very simple Irishman. You just need to ask my wife. I have gone on what I think is a fairly interesting journey since the start of my career. I started off life as a management accountant working in industry. Then I was looking for a bit more excitement. I moved into frontline project delivery, got to the stage of managing big transformational type projects. Then when I came to Australia about 15, 16 years ago, I wanted to do something different. And I set up my own company, and I've been a passionate educator ever since then. A lot of what really drives me is trying to make sense out of things, trying to simplify things down. And a lot of what I've been doing with now is working with clients to help them enable performance and achieve outcomes, but in a way that helps them to understand what the really important things are that they need to focus on. There's a quote that's there and actually behind me on the wall here. It's a quote by Einstein. If you can't explain things simply, you don't understand them well enough. And that's really what I sort of try and live and breathe in what I'm doing. What's the little journey I'm going to take people on over the course of this session? The first thing is we'll talk about looking at the kind of world we're living in. We're all trying to navigate our way through. And obviously this sets a bit of context for what I want to talk about here, learning to unlearn. And to me, that's a very important starting point. Then we'll talk about what's the difference between learning versus unlearning, because to me, these are two very different things. And it's important that people understand how and why they're different. And then we'll talk about, well, how do we, go about trying to do unlearning in a more consistent and a deliberate basis, and how we can do that. And then we'll talk about, is unlearning a bigger deal now than what it has been in the past? What's the reality of the world that we live in? And then very, very importantly, is that you're going to be listening to me for 50 minutes. And I'm hoping that this is going to inspire you to go and do something after this. So what's that next step that you're going to do? And I'll be very disappointed if that doesn't happen. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to tell you a little bit of a story which I heard, which really, really resonated strongly with me. Later in his life, Einstein went over to the US to teach in Princeton. And he was teaching a physics class. And he taught for the first year, and then it was the end of the second year. And it came time to sit the exam for the second year students. And his teaching assistant was chasing him to say, "Oh, Mr. Einstein, you still haven't given me the paper for the second year students." And he said, "Oh, hang on a minute. And he sort of went through his desk and he rustled through it and he picked up a piece of paper and he handed it to the teaching assistant. And she said, "Oh, thanks very much." And she's just walking out the door and she stops. And she looks at the paper and she said, "Excuse me, Mr. Einstein, this is the exact same paper that you gave the students at the end of the first year." And he said, "Yes, it is." And the teaching assistant said, "So how on earth can you give them the exact same paper that you gave them the first year in the second year?" And Einstein turned and smiled at the teaching assistant and he said, "Because the answers have changed." Now, I want to ask each one of you, do you believe the answers have changed now in terms of how do we go about trying to enable the best performance in our organization? Or how do we go about trying to, set ourselves up to be able to achieve our outcomes? Have the answers or make the most of our resources? Because I truly believe a lot of the answers have changed. Now, when I think about myself and I think about the kind of journey that I've gone on since I started my company, it's been incredible. And I don't know about anybody else, but I've really struggled to try and make sense out of the world and the environment that we're in. There's just so many different areas. There's so many different communities, and people and zealots in different areas that are so passionate that they have what the answer is in terms of what we need to do to be able to navigate through this sort of fast changing world. So if the answers have changed, what are some of the big important pieces in the puzzle? Now, I'm not going to stand here in front of everybody and say, listen, I've got all the answers. Absolutely do not. But things make a lot more sense to me than they did, say, 5 or 6 years ago. Here's what, at the moment, are big pieces in the puzzle that are sort of, I'm doing my best to try and connect them and try and make sense of how they sort of fit into the big picture of how we navigate through this sort of fast changing and challenging world that we live in. Now, and I shudder a bit because when I think back to maybe 6, 7 years ago, a lot of my world was all in the traditional project delivery space. And then I sort of went on this journey of discovery to try and understand all these other areas. And I went, oh my God, there's just so much other really important stuff that you need to understand or need to get your head around, because it provides important information to help try and sort of make sense out of, you know, how we move forward. Now, one of the things that I've used all the time when I've been doing any of my training or designing courses or workshops is Paretos Law. It's always, and it's such a powerful thing because, you know, whenever you look at sort of like a big area of content, you're always sort of asking yourself the question, well, listen, there's lots of noise here. What's the really important stuff? What's that critical 20%? And it's all about trying to discover what's the really important stuff, the important principles that sit behind everything. And to me, and that's a big part of my passion, is trying to find that. And I've been using Paretos Law all the time to help me to try and, you know, design and build kind of effective courses and workshops for my clients. And then last year, I read a book which had a big effect on me. The book was called The One Thing by a guy called Gary Keller. And Gary says that when it comes to trying to be successful at anything, he said it's all about trying to, you know, sort of line up a series of increasing size dominoes. So no matter where you are at any point in time, you know, you've got to be able to ask the question, well, what's a one small little thing that, you know, I should focus on now and do, which will then help me to build momentum and energy to be able to move forward into the future. And then the idea is, if I figure out what that one little domino is, that will then give me the ability to lay a foundation to be able to knock over something that's bigger for what I'm doing. So no matter what your situation and context, you know, it's like you don't worry about the big domino. You'd say, well, okay, what are the small little dominoes that we need to set up that are sort of getting bigger as we move forward? And I just think it's a really powerful concept. And it's like Paretos Law on steroids, you know, to try and help you to try and figure out what the important thing is. Now, I've got a hypothesis, and my hypothesis is that learning to unlearn is one of these small little starting dominoes. And obviously, as we go through the rest of this session, I'm going to be doing my best to try and convince you of that fact. Now, and you know, just to sort of try and bring this to life a bit more, I just want to play a little short video connected to this.
Everybody knows about playing with dominoes, but what you may not know is that a domino can knock over another domino, which is about 1.5 times larger. So what I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I will carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes, and the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready? Boom. That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, The last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
Now, I just think this is a really powerful concept. And like I was saying, my strong belief is that, when we try to move in and navigate through this sort of, volatile, changeable future, VUCA world that we're living in, then this learning to unlearn is one of those starting dominoes. So why is that the case? So this whole idea, what's the difference between learning and unlearning? Because to me, these are different things. And it's very important that people understand why they're different. Now, people might have heard of this great book that came out by Peter Senge in the early 90s. And ever since then, everybody sort of latched onto this. We need to build and aspire to build learning organizations. And to me, it's an absolute no-brainer that, when we think about the future is going to change. We've got to see ourselves as continuous learners. We've got to be able to learn new things. And that's just, that's a fact of life, and we've got to be able to do that. Now, when we think about that so like I said, I believe it's a no-brainer that we've got to see ourselves as these continuous learners. But while learning new things can be hard, I will argue very, very strongly that letting go of the past or unlearning the past is the far greater challenge. This is the really big thing, and especially if it's things that have helped you to be successful. Letting go of these is the really big challenge. Now, the first reference to organizational unlearning was made by this guy called Bo Hedberg in Oxford University Press back in, actually before Senge's book came out, but it didn't really get didn't catch on. And what Bo pointed out was that as knowledge grows, it simultaneously becomes obsolete as reality changes. Understanding involves both learning new knowledge and discarding obsolete and misleading knowledge, i.e. unlearning. Now, a really good example I came across to sort of try and, really illustrate this was in the medical profession. Back in the 1980s, it was generally the consensus was that medical knowledge was doubling every 30 years. If you fast forward to today, they reckon now knowledge is doubling every 5 years. Now think about the impact of that on new graduates, new doctors coming out. That means that if they want to stay current and relevant in their field, they're going to need to unlearn and relearn half of their knowledge base a minimum of 6 times over the course of their career, based on where we are now. Now, the question I would ask to people, to everybody on the call, is to say, well, when you look at your area, how fast is knowledge becoming obsolete? And I go back to my history of, when I started off and I set up my business, it was all about project management, and I was going to be a thought leader in the project management space. And then I suddenly realized that, well, okay, there's value in this and it's part of the puzzle, but boy, there was a lot of other really important stuff. And it's pretty confronting because I'd invested a huge amount of time and effort in doing that. So how do we define this term? And a great guy I know, a collaborator of mine and friend of mine, Barry O'Reilly, wrote a brilliant book called Unlearn, which came out at the end of 2018. And Barry's definition of unlearning is this. He said, unlearning is the process of letting go, reframing, and moving away from once useful mindsets, beliefs, and acquired behaviors that were effective in the past but now limit our success. So letting go of mindsets, beliefs. And what are beliefs? Beliefs to me are nothing more than thoughts that we have that we trust to be true. That's what a belief is. And then the other part of his definition here is it's not forgetting removing or discarding knowledge or experience, but it's the conscious act of letting go of outdated information and actively taking in new information to better inform decision making and action. Now, the way I like to try and explain unlearning as well is that it's like this water bottle. You know, this is each one of us, the kind of knowledge and skills and beliefs and everything that we have at any point in time. And you can see here, isn't it true, this bottle is full. Like, how many of us have lots of spare capacity? Isn't it true we're all being smashed in the kind of world that we live in? So this is us. And when you think about learning, learning isn't always a compounding activity where you add on top of what you have. If there's things that fundamentally disagree with what you have, you can't sort of just layer things on top. You've got to be willing to have that first step is so important of letting go. So you've got to open the tap, empty some water out and make some space, which then allows you to be able to learn that new thing. So to me, that I just, you know, when it comes to unlearning, that's that first step is you've got to let go. You've got to be willing to let go of something. Now, so, and I wanted to just, with everybody on the call, I want to just run a little Mentimeter poll about, you know, what do you think are your biggest obstacles preventing you from unlearning the past? So what things are stopping you now unlearning the past, letting go of old, you know, mindsets, beliefs and behaviors? So just take a moment to just do that Menti word cloud. So this is the one that's been generated from all of the input of the people on the call. And, you know, and you can see there's a hell of a lot of things here, you know, but the big ones, fear, you know, a fear of maybe losing control or fear of not being able to do it, confidence, ego, habits. So there's a lot of things that we have in our mind that are actually can be those blockages. Now, there's good news and there's bad news here. The good news is that when we come to unlearning, we do this already as humans. We unlearn. And to me, there's nothing better than the kind of world that we've been living in over the last 16 or 18 months, you know, with the pandemic. When I look around, I'm seeing unlearning happening by the truckload. And if I sort of just stop and pause for a minute, think about yourself. What have you unlearned over the last 16 or 18 months? Because to me, there's going to be a lot of stuff. You know, I think about myself. You know, I was running a lot of my business was all training business, you know, running workshops, training courses. And then, of course, when COVID hit, everything. And suddenly I couldn't do it. So then I had to go on this journey to try and, well, okay, you know, I had this belief around, you know, the only way I can deliver really good, effective training was face-to-face. And I said, well, I can't do that. So then I wanted this journey to try and build sort of blended programs in this kind of virtual world. And it's amazing what I'm doing now with the setup I've got here in this sort of studio I've got here in Melbourne. So, you know, and I think for all of us, you know, how we work, how we interact, there's been so much unlearning that's happened. And to me, this is just really important that people recognize, you know, when we talk about, you know, on the planet, who's the number one apex predator? It's us, it's human beings. We have this incredible ability to be able to change and adapt. And, you know, and the pandemic has just, you know, shown this or provides an incredible way of us being able to sort of see this. And if each of us holds up the mirror to themselves, you know, you'd say, wow, we've changed and adapted, you know, in an incredible way. So that's it. So when you think about it as humans, we unlearn. This is something that we can do. Now, the bad news here is if we're not faced with a COVID pandemic where things are taken out of our control and we have no choice but we've got to change, then, how easy is it for us to let go of the past, to unlearn, if we're not in that kind of an environment where we've got no choice? And to me, this is where I will argue that this is actually the big challenge, is because it's not easy for us to do it if we're not. And a big reason why is the way that we as humans are naturally wired. When we think about why do we do what we do? And, each one of us has this incredible organ, here, our brain. And you think about, how does our brain operate? How does it work? What are the big drivers? The first one is, first and foremost, your brain is wired for survival. It's all about keeping you alive. And it doesn't like uncertainty, because in evolutionary terms, to not know was to die. So it's always there trying to, looking for certainty in what it is. And then the other big driver is that it's the nerve center that controls everything about your body. So it runs the whole show. All of our different systems, our nervous system, our digestive system, our reproductive system, everything is all controlled here through our brain. So it's all about, it's trying to conserve energy because it wants to make sure that it has the power to manage everything. So it loves running on autopilot. And the latest thinking in neuroscience basically says that they reckon that 95 to 97% of the time, we're all operating on autopilot, where things are just happening, they're preconditioned responses. So this is a really big challenge. This is the way that we're naturally wired. And when we think about, why do we do what we do? And again, neuroscience would say that, one of the first things that we've got to accept is that everything we do, everything is driven by assumptions and biases that we have. And these assumptions and biases that we have will then drive our mindsets, our beliefs, the thoughts that we have. And then those mindsets and beliefs then drive the behaviors and the actions that we do. And then obviously, because we're operating on autopilot, we have these repeatable habits that we're doing. So this is the big challenge. This is the way that we're wired and why we do what we do. Now, I just want to try and bring this to life a little bit. And I've got a little image on the screen here. And if people are looking at this, people are probably seeing this spin from left to right. Now, you don't realize it, but you've already made an assumption, if you are seeing it spin that way, is that you're looking from the top down on that that central surface. So what I want you to do is to change that assumption and pretend you're looking up from it. So you might have to just squint in your chair, or maybe just blink your eye, and you should be able to, if you go and just imagine you're looking from the bottom up, you should be able to get it to flip the other way. See who can get it to flip the other way. So I'll look in the chat. Yeah, some people are. So this is just like a little example of an assumption that we don't even know we're making. And then by making that assumption, you see it a certain way. But when we change the assumption, we suddenly see it differently. So I just thought it was a good way to maybe just try and illustrate this. Now, I love this quote from Barry. Disruption doesn't apply to organization. The truth is it applies to individuals. When you hear about the narrative around disruption, isn't it true that, from an organizational context, we talk about, we've got to be innovative, we've got to bring out new products, new services, new features that we have. But a lot of times we don't realize that the biggest weapon that each one of us has to help us to be able to adapt to the environment, the world we have, is our mindsets, the beliefs that we have, and the behaviors that we do. This is our biggest weapon that we have. And you look at all of the great work that's been done. Carol Dweck is obviously the classic one, growth versus fixed mindset. Simon Sinek talks about an infinite mindset. To me, this is just so important. And we think about, what are the thoughts that we have that we trust to be true? What kind of limiting beliefs do we have? And we can see with the COVID world how so many of those were smashed. If you asked any kind of senior executive at the start of, January 2020, do you need to have your people in the office to get the work done? That was a belief that everybody had. And then you could see with COVID, that's changed. So how many other limiting beliefs are we each walking around with every day? Now, learning to unlearn. So if we've got this massive challenge that we're trying to go against the way that we're naturally wired, how do we do this? How do we make this more conscious, more deliberate, and to be able to do it more consistently? We need something to help us. We need a system. We need a pattern of thinking. And Barry introduces us to his very simple 3-step cycle of unlearning. And he said, this is how we go about trying to do this on a more consistent, deliberate, repeatable basis. So there's 3 steps. The first step is the unlearn step. And the first step is where we've got to be open and willing and curious and to be able to question and challenge our existing thinking, identify our assumptions, be willing to challenge those. And we have to be willing, open, and able to do that. And if we can't do that, then we're not even going to start the journey. So remember, empty the water out. Be willing to do that. Then once we've be willing to do that, the second step we've then got to say, well, okay, we've let go of something, so we've got to try and find something new. So the idea is if something's not working for us, we've got to figure out, well, what's a behavior that we could have a go at trying that will help us to be able to move to that outcome or hopefully solve that challenge that we're after. And before we start doing anything, the idea is that we've got to design a little behavior experiment. So here's a new little behavior that I'm going to try and do. But then before I do it, here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I think is going to happen. So that's my little experiment. And then once I design my little behavior experiment, the third step in the breakthrough step is where we've then got to execute that experiment. We've got to do it. We've got to try it. And then when we try it, and it's very important that we try something small, something that's not big, something small where it's safe for us to try and psychologically safe, maybe financially safe, physically safe, something small. And then when we do it and we execute it, this is where, and then, we may do it 1 or 2 times and then we reflect and learn. And the reflection and learning is really important because then we're saying, is it something, has it helped me move to where I want to go? Has it helped me to solve my challenge? And if it has, then maybe I'll do it in a bigger way. If not, I'll have to go around and try something else. And it's an iterative cycle. Now, I want to share a little example I have, and this was a real life example I had for an executive I was working with in coaching. And so what we have is we've got challenges, all of us have. And the idea is that you drop the challenges into this little cycle of unlearning, like a little flywheel. So we have a challenge, and this executive had a challenge where he believed he wasn't getting enough timely and accurate information on an initiative that was happening. And he was getting, his normal weekly report. But he felt he wasn't getting the right level of information. So what he questioned then, because he'd had an assumption or a belief that getting his standard weekly report was going to give him the information that he required. So then what we said, okay, let's design a little experiment and we're going to do something different. So instead he designed a little experiment where he would go down to the team area when they were doing their sort of end of week daily stand-up. And then he would just sit there as an observer in the background, and then he would decided to sort of stay around for a little bit, 5 minutes after that, talk to a couple of people. And then he wanted to see whether or not that would give him more information. So that was his experiment. And then he executed that experiment. He went down to the team area, the first time he did it, listened to what was the update that was going on. And then at the end, he sort of stopped and spoke to a couple of the people in the team. One person just took him through the Kanban board they had and explained it to him. And he came away thinking, wow, I can't believe the amount of information I got. And at that time, he was really seriously thinking, well, maybe I should do this every week. And he has. He's now changed his behavior to start doing this. And he's actually done away with the weekly report. He actually does this because he can now do it differently. So this was just like a little example. But the whole idea is we've got to, start doing this on a more deliberate, conscious and a deliberate basis. And it's like anything. Once we start, it's a simple little cycle, but simple's not the same as easy. But if we do it on a repeatable basis, we do something small that and it's this iterative cycle. And this is how we start to do this on a more conscious, deliberate basis. And the more we do it, it's like trying to build this into our DNA. Now, one thing I want to highlight to people, to me, which is very important, is the importance of behavior. When it comes to trying to change our mindsets or our beliefs, behavior is critical. Everything starts with behavior. You cannot talk your way to changing your mindsets or changing your beliefs or unlearning. You've got to act your way. So to me, and when we change our behavior, that changes our perspective of how we see things. And that, like that executive goes down to the team room, he's suddenly seeing things in a different way, seeing the board and understanding the board. Changes our perspective, which then impacts our mindsets and our beliefs, which then obviously, again, affects our behavior in a more consistent and that sort of habitual way. So behavior is really, really important. And, and especially for senior leaders, we can't, it's like this difference between rational approaches and normative approaches. You can't tell people to unlearn. They've got to see it and they've got to do it for themselves. That's really, really important. So unlearning and is it a big deal now? Well, let's talk about it and let's have a look at, what's the reality that we're all sort of facing now in terms of the world that we're looking at. First of all, let's have a look at the technology reality. This was a slide that I put together way before COVID, when I started to get my head, or I was trying to get my head around the kind of technology wave that was coming, this digital technology. And I put this together because I went, oh my God, like I could just see the impact of this digital wave coming at organizations. And you have all these different exponential technologies, cloud computing, quantum computing, Internet of Things, 3D printing. And then obviously the mother and father of them all, AI, machine learning, deep learning. And not only are these exponential in their own right, but they can combine together and amplify each other. So when you look at this, I was thinking, wow, this is just like, when you look at the kind of technology change that's coming at organizations, it was phenomenal. And then you have COVID. And to me, COVID has been like an accelerant. It's like you've poured petrol on this whole, technology, digital transformation piece. So it's speeded things up even more. And we can see how, those organizations who are digitally enabled and how they've thrived in this kind of world, and other organizations who didn't, they had to get their act together pretty quickly. But that's only starting in terms of what's coming. So I know it's very confronting, but this is the technology reality. When we look at the human reality, Gallup do all these polls over various different, the last big one that I saw that they did, they had this statistic which is just phenomenal. They reckon globally, 85% of the global workforce is not engaged. Like, it's absolutely phenomenal when you think about it. Not getting the best out of, our people in organizations. And, and when you look at this, how can you argue that, the answers are correct in terms of how we do stuff? There's some fundamentally big problems that are there in organizations. And what are the big problems that are there? And I want to ask the question of the whole group that's on the call, is this something that's happening? So when we look at, trying to, build organizations that can survive and thrive in this kind of fast changing, I call it accelerating VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We're trying to build these 21st century enabled organizations that, Patrick Lenzoni talks about healthy organizations where you can continually delight your customer, delight your people, and continually adapt. We've got to have organizations that are digitally enabled. That's like a ticket to play now, isn't it? You've got to have the right sort of infrastructure, architecture that will enable you to be able to engage with your customers and do things in an efficient, effective way. And then whether you like it or not, the world's going to keep changing. And we've got to, build organizations that can adapt and can do things quickly, can convert strategy into execution, and both ways are really important because the external environment will be changing. And this is where, when you look at all of the agile frameworks and lean thinking, it's all about trying to, have a way of working and a way of thinking that allows you to be able to, operate in a fast changing world and then also to get the best out of your people. So that's obviously what we're aiming for. But then when you look at organizations, what are we building that on top of? Are we leaving in place a lot of the old, industrial, mechanistic kind of management model, 20th century, thinking and process, and even 19th century management principles? So things like, specialization, command and control. And the big thing that people have to appreciate, these are very, very different sort of from an underlying thinking and a philosophy point of view. And not only are they different from a thinking and a philosophy, they actually work against each other. And to me, this is one of the biggest challenges that I see in organizations, that, if you allow these two to try and coexist together, it creates real toxicity because what you're saying and what you're doing are very different. Like the 21st enabled organizations are all about, empowering our people, trusting our people, intent-based leadership, autonomy, giving people autonomy. And then, you look at the process that you have. Let's just take an example, like, somebody saying down the organization food chain, oh, you're saying trust me, but hang on a second, I can't even spend $500 without going through a governance process to get sign off. So there's this inconsistency that's happening. And when you look at all of the areas around, how are they different, these two different sort of management models, from an organization point of view, from the way we manage risk and control, the way we fund, the way we go about making decisions, motivating and rewarding people, leading and managing. They're very, very different. And this is one of the really big challenges, I believe. So I'd just love to ask the group out there, do you see this happening in your organization? Are we trying to make something like this work? Are we trying to keep these two management models working simultaneously? Is this something that we see happening? So just again, if people wouldn't mind, we just do a quick poll. Getting the results in. So we look at, so there's a big, huge proportion of people agree that this is something that we're trying to do. And, and to me, when you think about this, if we do accept that is something that's happening, then I ask the question, how much unlearning needs to happen in organizations? When you look at the areas like finance, procurement, group risk and compliance, HR, all of the areas, there's a massive amount of unlearning that needs to happen. Now, obviously, this is really challenging when it comes to it. And I would go back to my little analogy of the dominoes. So again, we want to focus on, well, okay, this is a really big, challenging journey, but let's focus on what's the little domino that we can. And again, getting people open and willing to unlearn or understand and unlearn the past, I believe, is a really important first step. And then in each of the areas, there's always going to be the early adopters, the innovators, and we want to focus on them, which will then help to permeate that through each of the different areas. So, but it's just, and I know it's a massive challenge, but to me, it's really important that people understand this. I love this mantra from Barry O'Reilly. I just think this is just such a good one when it comes to trying to step into the future. You know, what's a great mantra that we should be sort of living and breathing all the time? Think big. So we all have this kind of linear thinking model typically that we're in. So it's trying to break out of that. So we're thinking bold, big about what that's to help us break out of our linear thinking. But then we start small, something where it's safe for us to do, something small, psychologically safe, financially safe, physically safe. And then very important, we learn fast. And to me, this is just so important. When you think about the world we're moving into, there's so much uncertainty. So how do we step into uncertainty? We've got to be able to step in to, do these small little things. Experimentation, like we said in that cycle of unlearning, we've got to see ourselves as experimenters. Most time people think of experimentation as something that's related to products and services, whereas each one of us has got to see ourselves as experimenters with our behavior. This is how we're going to learn. And I just believe this is such an important foundation for the future. So when we look at it and try and sort of pull the whole story together, in the past, knowledge and skills and experience may have lasted for a longer time. And each one of us has a natural sunk cost fallacy in our knowledge and skills. If it's taken us a long time to learn things and build skills, then obviously it's something that's very hard to let go of. But we've got to be, and I know it's very confronting, but when you look at the reality of the world that we're living in now, if we want to make sure and ensure we stay current and relevant, we've got to be open and willing to let go of things. And this is why this, starting and getting used to unlearning and relearning and using and applying Barry's cycle of unlearning, to me, is just so important. Because, if we want to, and you look at that cycle of unlearning, there's some really powerful stuff that's happening. Powerful and hard, difficult, not easy. Challenging our thinking, being willing and open, curious, willing to challenge our thinking. Start experimenting with our behaviors and then reflecting and learning. And it's that iterative cycle. And just, the faster things are changing, the quicker we've got to be, iterating to learn and adapt to help us to try and do it. And, and if we want to continue to stay relevant, then, I circle back to my little starting hypothesis. Learning to unlearn is one of those starting dominoes, because whether we like it or not, the world is going to keep changing. So we've got to try and lay a foundation for ourselves to be able to, whatever that world brings, we've got to be able to do it. And to me, this is why this learning to unlearn is just so important for stepping into that kind of future that we're all looking forward to. And then we build confidence, and we'll be looking forward to the future. So if we build this muscle to be able to do it, then to me the future is exciting. I love this quote from Mark Twain. It ain't what you know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And, and unfortunately, I know it's very confronting, but our expertise can become our biggest blind spot. And we've got to be very careful and again, be open and willing to challenge things. Because it's not saying you're going to become out of date immediately, but it's something, if the reality changes, things can become obsolete. And the other thing which I really want to bring home to people, I think, when we look at the future, curiosity is a superpower. to me, this is something we've got to all cultivate in ourselves. We've just got to be curious. And to me, if we're curious, and ask, what's the kindling of curiosity? It's questioning. So being able to ask, question, and challenge things is just so important when it comes to stepping into the future. So what's your next step? So as I said here, hopefully, as we've been going through this journey, hopefully I've inspired people to have a go. And the idea is, we're going to circulate this one pager at the end of the session. And I would just love for each one of you to sort of, identify a challenge for yourself. And isn't it true, if you've got a challenge or there's an outcome that you're not achieving, then that's a signal that maybe some of the beliefs that you are bouncing around in your mind, or some of the behaviors you're doing aren't working. So again, challenge, what's that challenge? What's that thing you're going to be willing to let go of, to question and challenge? And then, what's a little behavior that you can do? Something, and again, it's got to be something that pushes you a bit outside of your comfort zone. And design an experiment. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I think is going to happen. And then once you've got the experiment, you've got to execute it. Do it. And then maybe do it a couple of times. And then that reflect and learn is a really important step, where you say, well, what did I learn? Has it helped me to address my challenge or help me achieve the outcome that I'm after? Yes, no. If not, then I've got to find something else. I've got to go around the cycle. If I have, maybe I'll amplify it and do it in a bigger way. So again, and there's a link here to a more detailed canvas that Barry has designed, which again, we go into if people want to do it in more detail. But to me, this is just a really good basic level one that gets everybody started. A lot of companies, are already on this journey, and it's a lot of the tech companies, because of the nature of the world that they've been living in, a lot of them have sort of built this into their DNA. Two examples: Atlassian. I'm lucky enough, or I came across Atlassian when I started on my journey of really sort of enlightening myself with a lot of the stuff. I was introduced to them, and I thought, wow, what's going on over here? And I remember when we were running our first Unlearn event, I reached out to a really good friend of mine and said, would you be interested in coming to the event? And he said, oh, yes, no problem. And he said, can I bring a few people? And he basically brought the whole executive team from Atlassian to our Unlearn event. And it was just, to me, just this signal of, here's a company that in Australia, people would see them as being like the leading lights. But when you look at their senior leadership team, they were all in the kind of thing of, being open and willing to, be aware of the importance of unlearning and being open to challenging existing thinking. Another good example is Amazon. Jeff Bezos over in Seattle, they've got a building which is called Day One. So it's like everybody trying to make sure that people are not getting complacent, or always going to be willing to challenge things. And it's not just the tech companies. About a couple of weeks ago, a good friend was buying a bottle of whiskey, and he said, "Oh, look at this, Steve." And I thought, wow, here's an example of this great, Scottish whiskey maker, where they're thinking like this as well. And they're talking about experimenting with new types of blends, unlearning old ways. And trying to find new ways. And I just thought, wow, this is fantastic. So I love that. If you were doing any kind of big company-wide transformation, what would be the value of getting a start point where you had this kind of a situation, where you had the board, the C-suite open and willing to unlearn and relearn, and then all of the different functional areas willing to unlearn and relearn. Now, I know this is a utopian view, but how good a starting point would that be? And, and when I look at, I've been looking at a number of massive big transformations that have been happening down here in Australia. And I just see some really big problems happening where they're still leaving this kind of old world industrial model with the new world working together. And you can just see if we don't tackle some of these systemic issues and get everybody moving in the right direction. It's like finance. If finance aren't on board and with you and helping to evolve the way the funding mechanisms work, the way they sort of, account for, they manage the work and provide information, control information to the organization. If they're not on the journey and they're left behind, it's like the old world will just pull you back. It's like an anchor, it's like an elastic band. And I'm seeing this play out in lots of big transformations. And I just think there's some big massive mistakes being made in how people are going through these transformation journeys. Obviously, I was really excited when Barry selected me as to be his first globally licensed partner on his great Unlearn content. So again, like I said, I'm super passionate about this stuff, and you can see we have various different programs that we run, and a lot of it's all about customizing it for our clients in terms of what they need. Very important to recognize this is something that it's not easy. So you've got to recognize this is going to be a journey that you're going to go on. So it's all about trying to design programs that support that journey for everybody and help people sort of on this sort of, and it's a confronting journey when you're letting go of the past and, for stepping into that future. So I'd love to hear from people. If anybody want to know more about any of our programs, feel free to reach out. Just to wrap up, again, just really interested, we've had a big number of people on the call to get what your top takeaways are from this session. So just take a couple of moments to just, if you wouldn't mind, again, we've got a word cloud that we'll just pull up in terms of what you've taken away from, what are the biggest things that you've taken away from this really short session that we've had today. So this is a picture of the one that we pulled up, which, again, that's great. It makes me feel really good. I think, people start small, curiosity, think big, start small, open mind. So no, that's really, makes me feel really good that hopefully this is resonating. But again, like I said, I really hope that people will take that next step in terms of, having a go at applying this to their cycle of unlearning. Here's just a couple of key references that, again, in terms of some of the background thinking that sort of come into the way I've sort of designed this little presentation. And, again, as you can tell from the session, I'm super passionate about this stuff. To me, we all have families, kids, and, when I look at the work environment, everybody's just getting smashed. We've got to help people to be able to sort of, step into this kind of world. And organizations, if we don't address some of these systemic challenges, to me, it's like a rat wheel. The rat wheel's just going to get faster and faster. We've got to tackle these systemic issues, which will then help us to build organizations that can move forward with confidence into the future and have that ability to be able to adapt, as well as you're creating an environment where you're able to get the best out of your people. So anyway, listen, thanks everybody for your time. It's been fantastic being here, and wishing you all the very best on your unlearning journey into the future. Thank you.